So I'm going to read a few quotes from her reading to kind of fill out the three parts of today's Peace and Nature panel. Our first presenter today will be Sean Elliott from the Political Science Department. Humanities Department, my mistake. From the Humanities Department, Sean is a scholar, a gentleman, nature enthusiast, blues man, and all-around great guy. And he's going to be talking to us about
Peace and Nature and Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Peace and Nature and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So let's give Sean a big round of applause. And our second panelist is Cindy Elliott. I've got a little introduction for Cindy here. Cindy worked with Dawson, with Sustainable Dawson since 2006. Her favorite project being the horticultural designer of Dawson's Ecological Peace Garden. So she designed that infinity loop there, which is pretty awesome. She's currently taking a Sustainable Happiness course in a pilot program to become a facilitator. Sustainable happiness is happiness that contributes to the individual, community, or global well-being without exploiting other people, the environment, or future generations. So if you have any questions about Sustainable Dawson or about sustainable happiness, I'm sure Cindy would be happy to field any and all questions after she's done her presentation. So thank you all for coming. The floor, Sean, all yours.
Thank you very much. This is really fun to be talking about peace and nature, and I'm actually excited to make some common ground here with Cindy, because her article has a lot of overlapping connections to what I'm going to talk about, so this is fun. Here's a picture of one of the sunsets at my cottage, and so I spend a lot of time in my country house on the lake, and we spend a lot of time just staring. We just stare. And there's something to this, right? One of the things that intrigues me is how, when we're in nature, our notion or our relationship to time somehow changes, right? How do we feel and perceive time differently in nature? And why can we stare at a campfire or at a lake and not feel anything pressing? What is that? What's happening there, right? So, anyways, we're going to get into that. But before we get back to that theme, I want to talk to you about Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's one of the readings that you guys were given. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a famous philosopher from Geneva, Switzerland, and he lived in the 18th century. And he was part of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a period when many philosophers and political theorists used a reference to nature as some kind of foundation for understanding, explaining, and justifying or reforming human society. And so nature is a reference point, presumably, because nature is something that's seen as fixed, eternal, immutable, unchangeable. And this is what we call foundational thinking, when these philosophers were looking for some kind of firm floor or foundation from which to understand human society. And their idea was to figure out what we need to flourish as human beings. So, if you look at the second point, Rousseau, however, was born in the Enlightenment and was part of it and a famous figure, but he was what we call a Cassandra to the Enlightenment. He did not believe that technology and enlightenment itself were progressive things. He didn't think that history was progressive. And as one of the chapters, one of the sections that I gave you for reading mentions, is that since our fall from innocence, we live constantly in an age of regret. We always regret things. So nostalgia becomes a permanent part of human society once we exit what he calls the state of nature. Other philosophers talked about the state of nature, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau. They talked about the state of nature, and they defined it as a situation where we would not have any government, law and order, or any kind of civilization, really. And Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, famous British philosopher, said that the state of nature was grim and competitive. Life would be nasty, brutish, nasty and short, he says. Nasty, brutish and short. And society was a human artifice. It was artificial. but nonetheless we needed it. And that his advice to people was never overthrow government or engage in rebellion, because when we go back to this state of nature, it's nothing but chaos and mayhem. If we look at John Locke, another guy who talks about the state of nature, he said that the state of nature could be a very peaceful and benign place for a short time. And so he was known to be a revolutionary philosopher, and his idea was, let's overthrow the king, the British monarchy at the time, go back to the state of nature and start from scratch. And human beings could, for a short time, sustain themselves just through natural empathy and natural reason, what he called natural reason. And a good way to look at John Locke's state of nature is a little bit like a hobbit village, actually. Some other people have actually come up with this idea too. John Locke's state of nature is a little bit like a hobbit village. When you read the Hobbit series or any of the Lord of the Rings series, you read about geopolitics, but you actually never read about politics as such in the Hobbit village. There are no policemen, and just people get along with smiles and handshakes and little rumors and stuff like that, but there's no politics as such in one of these. So Locke's state of nature is a pre-political society, what we call a pre-political society. Rousseau, on the other hand, said that the state of nature was completely peaceful and innocent and without scarcity. And what he proposed is that all of these three philosophers, including Rousseau, start with an individual, some lone individual who lives in the state of nature. And for Rousseau, it's this lone individual who lives in the jungle or in the forest, which he calls the bon sauvage. And the bon sauvage is, in English, poorly translated as the noble savage, but it's just better to stay with the bon sauvage. And in his idea, and this is what we call methodological individualism. It's the idea of you start with an individual to try to somehow kind of reconstruct how society is created. Methodological individualism. And he says that this bon sauvage is a little bit like a golem kind of figure, right? But without the obsession with the ring, you know? This innocent little animal who runs from tree to tree and lives and picks apples and sleeps by the river, and who lives in a pure state of innocence. And my last point here on the bottom of the page is he gazes upon nature without awe and lives in a pure, pure present without notions of good or evil. He's innocent. He doesn't know good, he doesn't know evil. And he gazes upon nature without any sense of awe. And that's it. So he sees these little bon sauvages running around in the forest, you know, frolicking and being purely innocent. They don't fight over anything because there's lots of apples to eat and plenty of peaches to pick from the trees. No arguments. And they are living in a state of pure, total innocence. Eventually, what he says, Rousseau, is that we go from this individual existence into communal existence. We start to see other people and recognize other people. We start to live together. And at the time, and he said that this communal living, this early communal living, is the apex of human happiness. After that, it just goes downhill from here, right? And there's kind of an apex, because in a sense, at the same time that you have this apex of human happiness when we're living together in these small tribes, dancing around campfires and painting our bodies with makeup and stuff, it gives birth to what he calls vanity and private property. So at the same time that we become happy, it also plants the seeds of our common catastrophe. And that common catastrophe is the birth of vanity, the birth of the ego, and the birth of private property. And so what's revolutionary about Rousseau, in a sense, and he's a self-taught philosopher, so he's a heavy, what we call a heavy. The ego and the self are socially mediated. We see ourselves through the eyes of others, and then from that we also develop a mask. Okay? So presumably when people start to argue about their status, their ego, their private property, it brings us out of the state of nature. We develop institutions, we develop laws, we finally develop what's called l'État, the state, to regulate these conflicts. And when we fall out of this loop of nature, when we fall out of the loop of nature, it brings us out of the pure present. Because the nature is a state of eternity. It's a pure present. And when we start to live in society and we create civilization, we no longer are part of nature. We fall out of the present, and we acquire a notion of time. So he says here, my fourth bullet point, he says, humans who meditate are depraved animals. And that sounds very shocking, basically, right? He says people who think are depraved. You can definitely see his anti-enlightenment ideas here. But he's basically right. He's saying that reflection takes us out of the loop of the present and nature, and therefore makes us less animal and less innocent. Right? So when we start to reflect is the birth of some kind of human condition, right? And there we exit the state of nature. So reflection is kind of falling out with nature. And in a sense, what he's saying is that, I mean, think about moments when you're anywhere in fact, you're in the elevator, you're daydreaming, and bang, you hear a noise. And you suddenly fall out of your daydream. You fall out of your daydream and you become aware of what's around you, right? And so it's the same kind of thing. A good colleague of mine, Daniel Goldsmith, is also interested in some of these ideas of falling, right? That we are engrossed in something where we don't feel time. We're so engrossed in our daydreaming or the campfire or whatever it might be that we don't feel time, but then something brusquely breaks us out of that daydream and we fall, right? We fall. So his theory is quasi-historical. And by the way, this book that I gave you, that I sent you, the Second Discourse, Fidel Castro had it in his shirt pocket as he was leading the Cuban Revolution, because it has a famous passage about how private property and arguments about private property takes us out of this innocent state, right? Anyways, so whether you believe this story that we ran around the forest with little golems and then we created society afterwards, all the rest of it, you don't have to necessarily believe this. In fact, I don't think even Rousseau did. But what you could see it is as an analogy, or a parable. It's not biblical, but it's kind of like a parable, of how we go from consciousness to self-consciousness. Our fall from nature is a fall from innocence when we acquire a notion of the self and we start to be aware of the regard of the other, that someone is looking at us. Someone is looking at us, and we become self-conscious. We become self-aware. And that's the fall that he's talking about. That's where innocence ends. Right? That's where we just don't feel that we can just be ourselves. The other thing he says further on in the reading I gave you is that our perfectionism, as eventually when we are in civilization, we become perfectionistic. And he says our perfectionism makes us the tyrant of ourselves, others, and nature. The perfect lawn. The perfect boyfriend. The American dream. We transform nature because we want our ideals to become manifest in the world, concrete. And this is an interesting idea. Rousseau was very inspirational to a German philosopher called Hegel, who was an idealist. And that was his idea. The human mind is so powerful that we create ideals that are perfect images, and then we actually transform nature to bring this to reality. And so, we have lots of personal examples, I'm sure, where we become tyrants over ourselves and nature because we have these ideals. Mount Everest is littered with 400 dead bodies of people who have this ideal of reaching the top. I don't know about you, but my cat at home, the lovely Coriander, does not have any ideal or goal of climbing Mount Everest. Right? We have these ideals and we torture ourselves to achieve them. Right? Animals don't do that stuff. Right? So, and when we transform nature, we become tyrants of ourselves and others. We become tyrants over how other people look or what we expect of them. Look at our example, my favorite example of how we become tyrants over nature is geometric gardens. The geometric gardens of Versailles, or some of the Italian gardens that you can see in Italy or in the Mediterranean, are perfectly geometric and highly managed. And I think you can see this as a form of violence against nature, right? Violence against nature, where we impose some kind of structure or ideal on nature, and then we see this as kind of a manifestation of human ingenuity. You know, when I'm at the cottage, I don't overhear the squirrels or the raccoons saying, you know, Sean, your garden is a mess. Come on, let's get it cleaned up. Please, this is ridiculous. No, they don't do that. They have no such notions of symmetry and proportion that we do. So, Rousseau was quite controversial because he said, since our fall from the state of nature, civilization, urban humankind has become truly savage. So the true savage, really, if we want to use the word in the way we've appropriated, the true savage is civilized human beings. Our propensity to pity and compassion, which he says is basic to the most basic animals. The bon sauvage or any animals have some kind of basic pity or compassion. But the more we become urbanized, the more we lose that propensity to feel pity and compassion. We're too busy competing, we're too busy making our mark on the world, we're simply too desperate and scared to really care for others because of our competitive, property-based society. So what's interesting here is, if you look just down at the bottom here, Rousseau was an avid walker, a hiker, and a botanist. And he said he could spend hours staring into a buttercup or some kind of flower and going into the universe of this flower, right? Rousseau was kind of like a hippie before hippie before hippies existed, right? We're talking the 1760s, 1780s. He was kind of had a vagabond life as a wandering academic who had a lot of wealthy friends, by the way. And he was a very nervous figure, but he found nature to be his kind of the go-to place. He wrote a book called Reveries of a Solitary Walker. So nature was for him his refuge. Here's one of my questions that I want to address on the next point. When we gaze upon nature, right? When we gaze upon nature, I think that we gaze upon nature as beings that have already been torn from nature. In other words, the appreciation that we have of a sunset is from the fact that we are already alienated from nature. The bon sauvage, our little golems who run around in the forest in the story that he creates for us, have no awe. They don't have a sense of awe. Yet, we do. In civilized society, we have a sense of awe towards the sunset. Right? We have a sense of awe. I mean, when I arrived at the Grand Canyon for the first time many years ago, I just thought it was like a tourist trap, and I get to the edge of it, and my jaw dropped to the ground, and I couldn't talk for half an hour. But if I'd had my golden retriever with me, he would have just, just thought, well, where's the water, or where can I kind of just chill out? He wouldn't have had a sense of awe. So we have an awe in a sense because we've already become alienated from nature. So here's some questions that I thought we could throw around. Do we relax in nature because nature is not symbolically charged? For example, when I'm walking down the street, maybe I kind of like peer into, I live in the Plateau, so I can kind of peer into like people's, houses and see the cool walls and their cool decorations and say, wow, what a nice apartment. Cool. And then I start thinking to myself, oh, darn it, I think I have to start looking for a place to buy because it's time to buy. Okay, when I go back home, I'm going to go on the internet and look for maybe a place because we're kind of looking for a place to buy. So I keep on walking, and we're walking on the sidewalk, and I see a car. I think, well, this car is really like rusty. What is this guy doing with this old rusty car? And then I think, oh my God, I've got to take my car to the garage to get to change the snow tires. Oh, how long is my car going to last? And then I might walk into down St. Laurent Street and go into my favorite cheese shop and think, oh, I've got to do some grocery shopping. So when we walk around in an urban environment, it's symbolically charged because the objects there kind of address us with either duties or obligations. They're symbolically charged. Nature, when we're in nature, has no expectations of us. The trees are not talking to us. The frogs are not talking to us. It's not symbolically charged. They have no expectations of us. We owe them nothing in terms of conversation. There are no expectations of us. So maybe that's why we relax in nature. It's just a theory. As Hobbes and Rousseau say, nature does not lie, we do, right? And so in human society, we lie to each other, but nature doesn't lie, as Rousseau says. Nature's just nature. Why are we hypnotized by the spectacle of a lake, or meadow, or a campfire? And how does our perception of time change as we gaze across that lake or that campfire? These are just little questions I thought we would kind of throw out, and it kind of connects to what Cindy's article is about too. So there we go. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was awesome. So I'm going to read just a few quotes from Anya Len's reading, and then then Cindy can talk to us about her article and her experiences with gardens. So where is Anya Len's talk? Here, right here. How Science and Genetics Are Reshaping the Race Debate for the 21st Century. Vivian Chow. So the first quote would be over here. Ultimately, there's so much ambiguity between the races and so much variation within them that two people from European descent may be more genetically similar to an Asian person than they are to each other. So that's kind of interesting. The idea of using the term ancestry rather than race. In the biological and social sciences, the consensus is clear. Race is a social construct, not a biological attribute. Today, scientists prefer to use the term ancestry to describe human diversity. Ancestry reflects the fact that human variations do have a connection to the geographical origins of our ancestors. With enough information about a person's DNA, scientists can make a reasonable guess about their ancestry. However, unlike the term race, it focuses on understanding how a person's history unfolded, not how they fit into one category or another. So this idea, where are you from? What is your race? This idea that they know who you are. Oh, if you are this race, this means that you are this, that, and the other thing, which kind of pigeonholes people. Whereas the notion of ancestry is more like, where do your people come from? How is your life, how's your ancestral life unfolded over time? Which I feel is far less racist. Ancestry emphasizes the geographical origins of one's ancestors. Unlike race, the concept of ancestry does not focus on static categorization of humans into groups, but rather on the process by which a person's history unfolded. We share 99.9% of our DNA with each other. So we are far more similar than different. This should spark a connection with Diana Rice's comment to normalize our differences. Yes, we have differences. Yes, we need to respect those differences. There's a lot that brings us together. So something to consider. What else we over here? 0.01 variation has been sufficient. Scientific racism comes into play here, where different racist groups will use genetic information to support their racist claims. And so the reading concludes with this push to compel us to be genetically literate so as not to fall prey to the misuse of genetic information. My dad used to say, statistics don't lie, but liars generate statistics. So people can manipulate numbers. So it is up to us individually to be aware of these numbers and how they work so as to not allow a racist agenda to take the fore. Mounting scientific evidence has shown that humans are fundamentally more similar than different from each other. Nonetheless, racism has persisted. Scientific findings are often ignored or otherwise actively misinterpreted and misused to further racist agendas of extremist political groups. Opponents of these forces must, through their own education and awareness, combat these misleading interpretations and representations of scientific findings. It becomes ever more important to understand what our DNA says about it, what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. So I think these are some interesting ideas that come forth. I wish any of them were here. She's not, so let's wish her and her family all the best. And let us go to Cindy Elliott. So Cindy, just a little kind of thing. I first met Cindy on a project here at Dawson, a Tools for Peace thing, where one of the activities we did was to dig into the garden. And Cindy's knowledge of plants, of nature, of how things work is deep, 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 deep. Like I was blown away by her knowledge, and even more so by her enthusiasm, which I found infective. So rarely do you have someone who has a lot of knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm, but I think we're fortunate that both of our speakers today have both deep knowledge and great enthusiasm for the topic. So let's give Cindy a round of applause.
Mine isn't nearly as long as Sean's, but I was hoping to have interactive conversations with you all, and I'll get my 5 minutes of talking, and then maybe we can have a conversation. So John Muir wrote, "Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home. Wilderness is a necessity." Nature gives us a place to experience wonder and awe. When you walk into a forest, suddenly all of your senses become exemplified. You can breathe easier, the smells of earth and moss infuse your senses. Sunlight dappling through the forest canopy plays across the floor of nature like a moving piece of art. The wind, birds, and water bubbling in a brook or a stream is the music. When I go into a forest or sit by the side of a lake, I feel freedom. I become one with the forest, and my stress and monkey mind and anxiety that may have followed me from busy days at work or project or whatever it is I'm doing, they seem to fall away, and I can experience the forest because I am the forest. It makes me, I find that when that falls away, that I become into a calm peacefulness that makes me happy, and I never want to leave. In our busy technological world, being in nature can provide a grounding and centering for ourselves that alleviates the stress of everyday living. Even if you've never spent time in the wilderness, urban parks and gardens can offer the same feelings of peace and connectedness to all. It is a knowing and a feeling. It is like a balm or comforting to our hectic lifestyles. The article I submitted for the reading states, "Science is now showing that spending time in nature has a profound impact on our brains and our behavior, helping us to reduce anxiety, depression, and stress. It increases our attention capacity, creativity, awareness, and the ability to connect with other people." The research concluded that experiencing the beauty of nature increases positive emotion, perhaps by inspiring awe, a feeling akin to wonder, with the sense of being part of something bigger than ourselves, which then leads to pro-social behavior. There are many nature opportunities to increase our own well-being. Shinrin-yoku is a Japanese medicinal therapy that directs people in walks in a forest. And for people who have little or no experience or desire to be in the wilderness, I would think that this type of therapy would really give a person a sense of emotional safety when they're in the forest, because some people have never been to the wilderness, and if you've never been there before, everything is new and unknown, and for some people scary. For 25 years I've led and participated in women's wilderness retreats, where we would go deep into the forest, rent a chalet that had its own private lake or lakes, and just spend 4 days there. We'd have an opening ceremony and a closing ceremony. We could talk about our intentions of coming to this natural space. But during that time there, the only rule was that you leave your watch or phone at home. This just allows us to really really feel what it is to be outside in a natural environment and to become part of it instead of separate from it. I believe that being in nature allows us to live the true interconnectedness of all living things. It encourages our awareness and facilitates our attention. Did you know that putting your hands in the soil or earth has been scientifically proven to increase health and well-being? I'd like to read an excerpt from a website, Therapeutic Landscapes Network. There's a strain of bacteria in the soil called Mycobacterium vaccae, and it has been found to trigger the release of serotonin, which in turn elevates mood and decreases anxiety. On top of that, this little bacterium has been found to improve cognitive function and possibly even treat cancer and other diseases, which means that contact with soil through gardening or any other means is beneficial. We've got many beautiful gardens here at Dawson, and for me, the Ecological Peace Garden has over 70 species of native wild plants. So where you might not see wilderness on a regular basis, really you can walk outside the door during your school day and be in a place of wilderness through the type of plants that we have in the garden. You have the opportunity to use this garden for your well-being, and you can volunteer if you want to have your hands in the soil. Jen, my colleague at Sustainable Dawson right there, she's head of all the volunteers, and it's so much fun to be a volunteer with Jen because you're learning something every day, your hands are in the soil. If you're interested in plants or urban agriculture or bees or monarch butterflies, it's all here at Dawson. You can really experience a beautiful piece of wilderness within an urban setting. And what it has done, planting all the gardens that we have at Dawson with all the native species, is that it's attracted native wildlife back to an urban center. I think we've cataloged over 60 species of birds, something like that, Jen. And animals that we had a groundhog living in the Peace Garden for 2 years, and he grew accustomed to people and would come out and eat the grass and the clover and so on. But so the next time that you crave peace, go and take a walk out in the garden, sit on a bench or a big stone, and watch the honeybees from Dawson's rooftop hives gather nectar from the flowers, or absorb the scene of fluttering butterflies from the monarch nursery that we have here, or just walk around the paths and meditate or relax or whatever it is that will give you that sense of center and grounding and the interconnectedness of yourself with nature. I promise you, you'll feel rejuvenated and peaceful from this urban nature space.
Thank you very much for the
One thing I'd like to maybe get the conversation going before we turn it over to your questions is this idea of awe. So Cindy brings in this notion of awe and how we're awed by nature and there are beneficial effects from this awe. And Sean, you spoke about animals and nature not having a sense of awe, being so involved in awe, in nature that that it's the separatedness that allows us to feel awe. Maybe we'll start with Sean and then go to Cindy, and can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Do I need this? Shut, yeah. Yeah, I think that maybe what some philosophers would say is that our notion, we have a sense of awe and grandeur because we have some kind of intuition of what it takes to create. I mean, let's say, for example, you arrive at the Grand Canyon, and because we have some kind of intuition through civilization and through language and all these kinds of things, that we have some kind of intuition of the grandeur of things because we say to ourselves, wow, how many years did it take for the river to dig through this land and actually create the Grand Canyon? So we have a sense of awe because we have a sense of causality.
human beings have a sophisticated ability to create causation. A causes B and B causes C. And we do this through concepts and ideas. And because we have that machinery in our minds, it gives us a sense of awe because we think, wow, look at this, how did this happen, for example. So that awe,
I guess you mentioned time.
we have a notion of time.
How long did it take for this to happen, and how long is my life compared to the time it took for this
Exactly.
thing to be created?
Exactly, and animals don't have that notion of time.
Gotcha. Cindy?
For me, it's awe-inspiring when, like, I could sit in the garden and just look at one flower and be awed by it, because I'm amazed that one little seed can produce a flower that could be multi-layered or multi-petaled or has something unique. Every flower is so unique. I always wonder, how did all these different varieties grow from one little seed? And that gives me a sense of awe and wonder. Or watching the bees as they're, like, I always try to find the plants that the bees might like the best because of our hives here at Dawson. And they love scented plants, anything that's scented. And I just find that it's nice to find out what varieties do they like the best, and that's what I'll plant the next year. You know?
Chris Allen was telling us that we're delaying the mowing of the lawns on campus to allow cloves to grow.
Yes, yeah, clover, yeah.
And what is this allowing cloves to grow? This makes for different flavors of
Well,
honey? Or?
well, no. Well, clover is one of the most popular flowers that bees love. They just love it because it's very sweet, and there's a lot of nectar because bees have to travel 1,249 kilometers to make 1 teaspoon of honey. That's how far they travel. That's why the health challenge that Jen has run with the school nurses is called the 1249 Club because of our honeybees. That, can you imagine having to travel 1,249 kilometers to make 1 teaspoon of honey? That's pretty amazing. And growing the clover not only helps our honeybees, but it also gives nitrogen to the soil. So
Why is that beneficial?
Yes, if it's, I find green lawns like a desert, a biodiversity, or a biological desert, because there's nothing in them that are beneficial to anyone, really.
Which ties into what Sean was saying about these
Obsession.
these gardens, right?
Perfect lawn, people get on their hands and knees with clippers to make sure the lawn is perfect.
And zero biodiversity.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't contribute much of anything.
Yeah.
I bought a little house in Chambly 15 years ago, and when I moved in, there was a lawn in the back and a lawn in the front, perfectly groomed grass, and I ripped every bit of it. And I planted 3,000 perennial plants. That's how many I packed into that little space. And I remember I had a 10-wheeler truck of earth to be delivered, and I got it all delivered, but there's a slope on both the front and the backyard to make sure that water doesn't enter the house. Anyways, I covered it all with plastic, and this French gentleman came up to me one day, kind of gruff and a little bit mean, and he said in French, "What do you think you're doing, madame, with all this plastic around?" And I said, "Oh, don't worry, monsieur. Next week there's 40 flamingos coming, and I've got about 100 plastic flowers, and the whole front and back will be covered in plastic." And he goes, "Ha!" And he walked away. And I thought, what the heck is that? But over the years, the more plants that I added, or the more my gardens evolved. When I first moved there, I'm in a townhouse, and there were 8 of them in this little curve, and not one of them had a garden. There wasn't one flower to be seen front or back. And within 3 years of me planting, I would just put out pots if I had too much of one type of plant or another, and I donate, to give for free. And I'm so proud because today, through me doing really nothing other than giving away plants, every single townhouse now has their own gardens, and they've learned about urban agriculture, and they're growing their food like I am. And it's really interesting how people get that sense of awe of working with nature and what can become of it.
Thank you very much. When something when you were talking about the awe you feel at just one flower,
Yeah.
it reminded me of coming from a religious studies background, the Upanishads, 600 BCE, India. There's one particular Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, that tells the story of Shvetaketu and his father, Uddalaka, and Shvetaketu goes out and studies, and he gets very heady, and he's very intelligent. He comes back, and he's questioning the meaning of life, and his father realizes he doesn't really understand what life is about. So he says, okay, go over there and get me a pomegranate from that pomegranate tree. So the kid goes off, gets the pomegranate, brings it back. The father says, okay, what do you have there? He says, a pomegranate. He says, cut it in half, okay? What do you see? Cuts it in half. He says, I see seeds. He says, okay, great, take out one of those seeds, okay? Cut it in half. What do you see? He says, I don't see anything. He says, that which you don't see, that is you. The essence of that seed, the life force in the seed, that one seed that if planted creates a tree which creates hundreds of other pomegranates and hundreds of seeds within each seed the potential for another tree.
Exactly.
And that is us. And so maybe this sense of awe is kind of a relating to that life essence.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is, well, for me, I find if I'm anxious about anything, being in nature seems to take that away, and in a way that it gives me back my life essence. You know, it's like I can, mostly if it's in the wilderness for me personally, as soon as I walk into a forest, I just am so grateful. I'm just filled with gratitude that, thank God I'm here. Oh, I've missed you. You know, like I'm talking to my to everything, to the rocks and the trees and the sunlight and everything else, because I'm so grateful to be back where I feel like I belong. So that's, that's different strokes for different folks, but I think nature is a huge catalyst for our well-being, for sure.
Sean, nature and belonging?
Nature and belonging.
Yeah, so Cindy says she gets into nature, she feels she belongs. And I think we can understand belonging as a human need, like a human drive to belong.
Yes.
And Cindy feels a sense of belonging when she enters into nature. Do you feel a sense of belonging when you enter into nature?
Coming home.
No, I just feel that I'm not being judged. And because I'm not, because the nature has no expectations of us, as I said before. They have no expectations of us. So there's no, it's like you're kind of going into neutral territory where there are no expectations of you, and that's why you can relax. You can relax because there are no expectations of you.
That was when I first went scuba diving. The fish don't care.
They're totally
They're
different.
not looking. I thought they'd be looking at you or something. They're doing their thing, and
Yeah.
like, wow! And I felt I could relax.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Very nice. Thank you very much. Questions? Anybody have a burning question? Renato, you have a question for one of our speakers? Jay? Can come back to you. Nazmin? Pardon? Sure. Tina?
Well, I didn't have a question, but the whole thing just kind of reminded me of how, like, my dad doesn't care about the garden or anything, or mowing the lawn at all. Like, he doesn't care about the way we look, and compared to all our neighbors, like, they all keep everything perfect, but us, we have the most animals on our lawn all the time. Like, we have the most birds, we have groundhogs every year, we have tons of rabbits, we've had ducks, we've had foxes even, and skunks and all sorts of stuff.
And how's the
Or a
family
variety
feel?
of things for them to eat and stuff like that, so.
And what does that do for your family, having this free lawn and with these animals coming to visit?
Since we don't care about the way it looks anyway, it's kind of nice to just always look in the backyard and there's like always a rabbit there or something like that, like all the time. There's always just something to see that we don't see every day.
And do you feel a sense of awe when you see these rabbits, or do you feel a sense of joy?
Yeah, I like watching them.
Okay, very nice. Brooke, do you have a question? No questions? Okay.
Well, let's talk about your tomatoes then.
Go ahead. So some tomatoes are dying, which is unfortunate, and plant and facilities have said, look, if these tomatoes are dying, we're just going to take them away.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about to give you a hack or anything, but what did you experience when you planted them, and for the people who have taken care of them and nurtured them, and some of them, from what I've heard, are really nice. So, what was that feeling of nurturing plant from seed to fruition?
I felt like joy, and then after hearing what you said about like how we feel in nature, it kind of makes me think about how I like to like go to the lake with friends, and like I just like it for some reason. I feel inspired now that I want to make like my own garden at my house.
If you want to learn anything about that, you have to come and see us at Sustainable Dawson, and Jen will get you on the.
So anyone can volunteer, Sustainable
Yes.
Dawson?
Yeah,
And we go to Jen DeVera?
yes,
Okay, jdevera@dawsoncollege.qc.ca.
that's it.
Faith, you cared for your tomatoes, how was that
Yeah,
experience?
I think, I don't know, it's fun to care for the tomatoes, especially when friends are like on Fridays after class, or right before the presentation, we went to go see our tomatoes. It's fun to just like take care of them. We get really into it. Our tomatoes got really big, so we got poles for them, and like, I don't know, it's fun to do it together.
Awesome. So who do you do it with? All right, tomato team, very nice, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Jay, you thought something through?
I guess for the tomatoes, at first mine didn't seem to grow, and I was certain it had just died or I did something wrong, but I started going to see it more and more often and like checking up on it and watering it, and now it seems to be doing okay. It's small, but it's getting there.
It just needed your energy, you know that.
Yeah.
You're the one who planted the seed, so just you being your presence around it would help it grow.
Sean? Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also added like,
Okay.
I also added like 2 plants to it because I went to like the club spaces, and they were doing some kind of plant thing to it, so I have like a little chive plant growing there, and Jake is fun. Sorry?
Is his name Jake?
No, that's my friend's plant. It's and a spider plant growing there, so I put them next to the plants. Hopefully they'll be doing well.
Very nice, you create your own mini garden in there. Nice. Leah?
I have a question. Is now like my plant's like kind of big. Do I have to like transplant it into like a pot?
Is there a plan to, with urban seedling or anything, but no, tomatoes might be during Earth Week, but tomatoes love heat. That's bottom line with tomatoes. And they're kind of like an herb called basil. And if it's anywhere below like 12 degrees Celsius, they're gonna just go frigid on you, and they get weaker and weaker. And it takes them a good month to come back once the weather is warmer. So the biggest thing with tomatoes is to keep them warm, but have you staked them up? Have you put a stake into them? So if you think that the pot, what do you have them in, those little?
Yeah, the water bottles, but now like,
Oh.
because it like falls over and it's leaning into the window, so I thought maybe I should bring it home and put it in the pot. It's like my room has like a lot of light.
Oh, well, that's a good idea. Or the other thing is, when you bring it home, make sure that you've got a lot of plastic or something to protect it, because just walking outside with it in the temperature we have now could kill it. By the time you get it home, it could be dead. I only know that because I bought a basil,
I took it out.
and just from walking from the grocery store to my car, that wasn't warm, it died. And I just went, wow. I knew that I never plant out basils or tomato until around June 5th. I always leave it as the last thing to plant. But starting your seed, Bravo, I would get a bigger pot though, because you don't want to have it only roots and no earth or nutrients for your plant. And then you can stake it. So go to the dollar store and just buy a $1 pot, that it has room to grow in for you. And it'll get fatter and stockier instead of really long and thin. Some get really long and thin because they're always reaching for the light, but they don't have the nutrients base to actually grow the roots, because the roots are like the foundation of a garden is earth, and the foundation of any plant is its root system. So it's about nourishing the roots to have your plant become healthy.
Next Friday, we do not have class, Easter. The Friday after that, we will be tending our plants. So we're going to go and see what can be done with the plants that are not doing so well, with the ones that are doing well. And that was a fun activity last year, so I hope it'll be a fun activity again this year. Lori?
I have a question. So my tomato plant is not doing so well, but the leaves at the end are kind of dry, but the root is still green and it looks like alive. Do you think there's like if I just add water, keep care of it, it's gonna come back? Or?
What do you mean the roots are green?
Yeah, but it's just like the leaves are really dry. Well, they're kind of dry-ish, but it fell.
But that could be happening from overwatering as well.
Okay, is
That
it?
they turn brown and dry up.
Okay, so is it dead or?
And the fact that you said the roots are green makes me think that it's been so well watered that it's almost got its own algae growing. So it might go with you after this and check it out.
Let's go.
But, and Jen too, because she's helping you guys a lot with that.
So you guys have a few minutes?
Sure.
So if anybody has any questions related to their plants, so we can go and check out the plants and you can look at them in person. We've got two experts here to help us out. Let's have a big round of applause for some of